I'm doing a refutation speech on the genetically modified organisms. My opponent has stated that genetically modified foods are completely safe for consumption. Two, biotech crops make other crops less susceptible to extinction, and biotech crops help with global food crisis. In response to the first claim, genetically modified foods are completely safe for consumption. Foods are not completely safe for consumption because they are patented, which basically allows the person who invented it to hide the information because it's secret. They don't want anything to be given out to competitors. And as such, they can't reveal everything, which can also end up being, people might end up being allergic to these without ever actually knowing until they get allergic to it. And then in Los Angeles Times, it stated in 2011, agriculture companies defend their stonewalling by saying that unrestricted research could make them vulnerable to lawsuits if an experiment somehow led to harm, or that it could give competitors an unfair insight into their products. But it's likely that companies fear something else as well. An experiment could reveal that a genetically engineered product is hazardous or doesn't perform as promised. This shows that what is hidden or can be hidden. And then furthermore, I found more evidence going with the Avicenna Journal of Medical Biotechnology stated many scientific data indicates that animals fed by GM crops have been harmed or even died. Rats exposed to transgenic potatoes or soya have abnormal young sperm. Cows, goats, buffaloes, pigs, and other livestock grazing on BT maize or GM cottonseed and certain biotech corn showed complications including early deliveries, abortions, infertility, and also many deaths. This obviously goes against how they are not completely safe for consumption. And then in response to his secondary claim, biotech crops make other crops less susceptible to extinction. He goes on with the example of Gross-Macoun strain. That example is mostly a theoretical approach, and there was no other mentions of crops being genetically modified to be able to go against the pine mold disease that he had mentioned, which would have shown the effectiveness of the GMOs if he had done a specific example. And then furthermore, the harm GMOs have to predators. Biotech crops are less susceptible to extinction. This doesn't show what would happen to other creatures that are affected, because there are predators such as found in the global research. Amos stated one of the major reasons of the bees' decline is the ingestion of GMO proteins. This is problematic as there is such an increase of indigestible foods in humans and bees. And then let's continue on to the third point. Biotech crops help with the global food crisis. Though the food that can help the global food crisis, there are no examples of companies or governments already giving out safe GMOs to reduce the food crisis. And then in the Pakistan Journal of Science stated in Oregon, scientists found GMOs bacteria meant to break down wood chips, corn stalks, and lumber waste to produce ethanol, with post-processed waste to be used as compost, rendering the soil sterile. It killed essential soil nutrients, robbing the soils of nitrogen, and killed nitrogen capturing fungi. This does not help the global food crisis because it reduces the amount of area that that regular crops can be planted. And then in conclusion, genetically modified foods are not safe for consumption. They do not make crops less susceptible to extinction, and then biotech crops do not help with the global food crisis.
All right, there's a pretty good summary of the advocate's argument. You've got a counterclaim that says that basically they're not safe, at least especially on the first point. The argument about them being patented, and because that being patented, that they keep information away. At first I'm wondering, well, why is that particularly important? Then you've got a piece of evidence that explains it a little bit. So I think that there is some substance to that argument. I don't know that it directly contradicts the advocate's position on this point and shows that there's any particular risk, but it explains why there might be a risk that we're not able to see. There is kind of this inference that suggests that there might be allergens that are being created there. I think you need a little bit stronger argument on that particular point. The evidence that you do have on this point suggests that GMO products could be problematic for animals to consume, and then you've got some studies that refer to that. So I think there is good reason to believe that you presented a counterclaim here that suggests that there's some risk. I think you need a little bit stronger attack on the advocate's arguments at this point, but your counterclaim, I think, is pretty effective there. On the same point, on the second point where you're talking about how the biotechnology supposedly is going to decrease the risk of extinction of crops, you suggest that the only example that the advocate has is a theoretical one, and it's an old one. I think that's reasonable, and you've got a good press that suggests that there aren't any other examples. And then there's an interesting kind of counterclaim built in here. I don't know that it automatically applies here, but since it does involve the issue of extinction, maybe there's some application, and you make the argument that suggests that genetically modified foods have something to do with the decline in bees, and that's of course going to have an impact on fertility of crops and that sort of thing. So a little bit indirect, more rebuttal issue on that particular point, but I thought it was an effective thing to present, and it's applicable. And then on the third argument, I thought that you had a good challenge on any specific example that the advocate's citing, and then there's this kind of counterclaim that says in actuality it could reduce the available usable land. I think that needs a little bit more explanation, kind of rush through some of the evidence that's being presented. It's not quite as clear, but I think ultimately the point that you're making seems to suggest that by utilizing these resources, the soil that previously was available to use for any kind of crop now becomes limited to only particular kinds of crops. I think that's kind of what the argument is there. I think that could be a little bit clearer, but that's a good answer to that point. All right, I'd lose the gum while I was giving the presentation. It's a little distracting, and try and look at us occasionally. That would be helpful in your credibility issues. All right, thank you.